In the kitchen today, we are going to be talking about whole grains versus refined grains. Let's start with just a basic bit of information on what a whole grain is. So a grain grows and it has a seed that has bran, germ, and endosperm on it. If we take off any parts of that grain, like the bran part of that grain, we turn it into a refined grain. So a whole grain is the whole grain intact, while the refined grain has been refined or parts of that whole grain removed. So what products are whole grains? Well, there's some things that are naturally whole grains. For example, whole oats. Those are a whole grain. And if you look on the back of the label on the ingredient list, it will say whole grain rolled oats. That's a whole grain. Quinoa. This is an example of a whole grain. If I look on the back of this, it doesn't say the word whole, but it does say white quinoa, and quinoa is a whole grain. Whole wheat is another example of a whole grain. So if I look on the back of this pasta box, it says whole grain durum wheat flour. It has the word whole in it. Brown rice is a whole grain. If I look on the back of this, it says brown rice. It doesn't necessarily say the word whole. So sometimes the word whole, when you see it, you know that that's a whole grain. If it doesn't say whole, it might just be a grain that is naturally always whole, such as quinoa or brown rice. Now over here I have some examples of some refined grains. For example, here's some pasta. If I look on the back of the label here, the ingredient list says semolina wheat. It doesn't say whole, and I know for wheat to be a whole grain, I need to see the word whole. If I look on these crackers, the first ingredient here is enriched flour. That's usually a cue when you see the word enriched that it is a refined grain. They've refined the grain and then they've enriched it with the nutrients that were removed when they refined it. White rice is always a refined grain, and if I look on the back of this, it just says long grain rice, but on the front it says enriched, and again, that is my cue. Let's talk about bread. Now some will be pretty obvious that it's not a whole grain. Here I have a loaf of white bread, and again, if I look on the ingredient list, the first ingredient is enriched wheat flour. So that's a cue, this is not a whole grain. Here is a loaf of bread. It says multi-grain, but that doesn't really mean anything. I have to look at the ingredient list. And when I turn it over and look in the ingredient list, I see the first ingredient is whole wheat flour, then water, then whole grains. So this is a whole grain. So you can compare labels by reading them. Let's do one more, which is cereal. So I've got a wheat-based cereal here, Golden Puffs. I look on the back, this one is interesting. The very first ingredient is sugar. That means by weight, the biggest ingredient in this product is sugar. The next one is wheat, and it doesn't say the word whole, so this would be a refined grain. If I look at this box, this is a box of wheat checks, and I flip it over on the back and I read the label, and its first ingredient is whole grain wheat. Let's recap. We have whole grains and it's the whole grain. So the grain is intact. Great examples of whole grains are oatmeal, quinoa, whole wheat, brown rice. Some other things that I don't have examples of here, millet, whole corn. Those are all whole grains. A refined grain is when we take the outer part of the grain off and we refine it. We often add back in nutrients to refined grains. On the label of a refined grain, you'll often see the words enriched. For example, on this bread, it says enriched wheat flour, and that's a cue for you that that would not be a whole grain. My challenge is to go find some products either in your home or at the grocery store and see if you can identify the whole grain products and the refined grain products.